You've been told you had a childhood. You know you did because there are photographs sitting in boxes somewhere, and your parents have the stories ready whenever you ask. But sit quietly and try to find the actual felt memory of being 2 years old, the real sensation of being that small in that room with those people surrounding you, and there is nothing. Not blur, not fog, nothing. Scientists have a name for this. Infantile amnesia. The complete inability to consciously recall anything from the first 2 to 3 years of life, and only fragments from the years just after that. The obvious answer is that the infant brain was simply too undeveloped to form memories in the first place. A newborn's hippocampus, the brain structure most responsible for encoding new experiences, is still building itself. The prefrontal cortex, which handles context and conscious access to the past, does not reach anything close to maturity until well after age 3. So the old theory was clean and simple. You don't remember being 2 because the filing system wasn't built yet. Nothing could be stored because there was nowhere to store it. That logic held for decades. Then researchers started running controlled experiments, and the evidence stopped cooperating. The filing system, it turned out, was not the problem at all. The problem was something else entirely. In 2016, neuroscientist Christina Alberini at New York University ran a series of experiments on juvenile rats. She exposed them to a mild foot shock at a very young age, waited until they reached adulthood, and then tested whether they could recall the experience. They couldn't. Not on their own, but when she gave them a brief reactivation cue, a small reminder that something had once happened in that environment, the memory surfaced. The memory had never been erased. It had simply become unreachable, sitting intact somewhere beneath conscious access, waiting the entire time. It was the first strong experimental evidence that forming a memory and retrieving a memory are two entirely different processes. The brain was recording all along. The problem was never the recording. The problem was the playback. So, if the infant brain can in fact form memories, why can't you reach them? The answer lives in a concept researchers now call the autobiographical self. Before the age of about 2.5, a child does not have a stable sense of being a continuous person moving through time. There is no felt experience of a self who is here, having this moment, who will still be here tomorrow and can look back on it later. Without that anchor, an experience has nowhere to attach itself. It floats unconnected to any narrative thread and eventually drifts entirely out of conscious reach. You were present for everything that happened to you during those years. You just weren't there as you. And that distinction between presence and selfhood is, in many ways, the whole explanation. Language deepens the problem further. Autobiographical memory doesn't just require a self, it requires a story, a beginning, a middle, a sequence, a sense of before and after, a framework of time actually passing. Language is the architecture that makes that structure possible, and most children don't begin developing functional language until somewhere between 12 and 24 months of age. Before language arrives, your brain can learn. It can recognize your mother's face from a stranger's, it can track patterns, absorb emotional tone, develop early preferences. But it cannot narrate. And without narration, an experience cannot become a memory you can consciously hold and revisit years later. The brain was absorbing the world at a furious rate during those early months. It just had no way to file any of it under a label that a future version of you could ever locate. Here is where it gets stranger still. Even the earliest memories that adults believe they can recall are not necessarily what they appear to be. Childhood amnesia researcher Carol Peterson spent years documenting how people describe their own earliest memories, and what she found was that those memories shift over time. Ask someone at age 20 what their earliest memory is, and they'll give you an age, maybe 2.5. The boundary moves forward. It may just be the first one that survived long enough to be found. Emotional weight determines which memories make it through and which ones disappear entirely. A 4-year-old who gets separated from her mother in a crowded store, running between aisles in a panic, is far more likely to carry that moment forward than a quiet afternoon at home. The brain under emotional stress releases hormones that deepen encoding, pressing the experience harder into neural structure. Fear, surprise, physical pain, intense joy, these are the forces that mark a memory as worth keeping. This is why so many of the earliest memories people do retain are charged with something strong or frightening or sharply unusual. The brain wasn't preserving what was most important to your development. It was preserving what felt most dangerous in the moment. The profound and the routine disappeared at roughly the same rate. Only the charged survived. And then there is the question of what happened to everything else. The months and months of learning, the faces and warmth and repeated daily experience, the world as it actually was for you during the most intense learning period of your entire life. That record still exists somewhere. Alberini's research suggests those early memories were encoded and never destroyed. Implicit memory, the procedural and emotional knowledge you carry without knowing you carry it, your comfort with certain sounds, your instinctive response to certain voices, your fear of certain sensations, was all laid down in those early years and never left. It just lives below the threshold of conscious recall, shaping your behavior without ever rising to the surface as a scene you can actually watch. The early years didn't vanish, they went underground, and they've been running things from down there ever since. What you cannot consciously access is not nothing. The experiences that built you are still present, operating below the reach of language and narrative, and the autobiographical self, influencing the person who would eventually become capable of forming retrievable memories. The first 2 to 3 years set the architecture. They determined the emotional defaults, the instinctive responses, the deep patterns of trust and fear that have quietly followed you everywhere. You cannot see any of it. You cannot point to a single scene and say this is where that came from, but it is all down there, holding up the structure. And the question worth sitting with is this: what exactly was being decided about you in the years before you were ever watching?